Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's been a privilege to be here listening to so many conversations today. And I think that was a prize within the prize. I mean, the possibility of being in touch with so many people who came together because of this occasion. So we are the last ones. So also thank you for being here with us until now. Thank you again to also Art Basel for hosting us. Our conversation is here with, as we were saying, Marcel Pardo Ariza, Ambrose Trataris from Art Handlxrs X in San Francisco, and Robert Leckie, says Gasworks, London, director, but also representing as part of a larger network, the Triangle Network, which is an association of artist-run spaces. So just to introduce our chat, I would suggest we also think through the fact that the categories we're falling under is allies or forms of alliances. I think the entire network is a form of alliance. So I think it would be nicer maybe to rethink through certain categories, especially because we've been walking in and out of them so many times during our lives, professional lives, and not only. So as much as one of the last architecture biennial curated by Leslie Locko had adopted that definition of practitioners, it was so widely encompassing, so many things happening that maybe we could also play along these lines and maybe stop chopping things up in ways which create differences. That says, on to you. You know, you've also prepared some materials to introduce yourself, so I would pass the word on to you and ask you to introduce your work and sort of walk us through a little what you're doing with your respective organizations. And there's a video.
What would you change about the art world?
I would get rid of the air of elitism.
The way that art handlers can be treated sometimes.
It's a kind of a risky job. Health insurance would be nice.
We are limiting ourselves in every possible way when we only include one type of voice, one type of narrative, one type of visual.
You know, there are many art worlds. There have always been many art worlds, and now the mainstream art world is trying to show knowledge of things that it did not pay attention to before.
What does an art handler do? What doesn't an art handler do?
Art handlers make it happen. They're the labor that's involved in museums and the gallery shows, the exhibitions you see.
It's on. Hi, everyone. My name is Marcel Pardo Ariza. I am one part of Art Handlxrs X.
And I am Ambrose Trataris, and I am the other part.
So we started this project because we realized that, you know, there was so much behind all of these structures that was not being acknowledged. Like many art students, we ended up doing art handling at some point. It's such an easy entry way into the art world. And then we realized that it was both a really exciting job and a very risky and exploitative job. And we realized that we really need to talk about that stuff. I personally got into art handling first when I moved to New York in 2013 or something like that. And it sort of served as this way for me to fulfill my visa requirements, which meant that I was doing an internship that was unpaid, which that should obviously be abolished by now. But so we were doing, I was doing this internship that was unpaid, and I was put in very risky situations, where I was maybe asked to demolish an installation that had fiberglass, but no one was telling me to use certain safety equipment, right? So there were all of these situations that were very strange, But then, you know, there were also really exciting moments where Ambrose and I went to the San Francisco Art Institute. So we got to work with Alejandro Almanza Pereda, who built a pool. So we helped him build a pool to take photos underwater, right? So you had this kind of both worlds where you are making our world, like our works happen that are so strange, and at the same time you're kind of in this job that doesn't really get acknowledged or credited properly or compensated properly. So we started doing this project.
Yeah, and we wanted to start to connect with other people who were working as art handlers or preparators and see if there were people in the field who also identified as women, queer people, people of color, trans people, because there was such a specific kind of pathway into art handling that was through word of mouth, and that word of mouth was always the same kind of mouth. So the same kind of people were being hired. And it actually results in a working environment that continued to be dangerous because you don't have different people having different experiences, asking the questions of, how do you do this? How should we be doing this? Actually, I don't like this. Can we communicate differently? You know, can we actually count down before picking up a crate? And we found a commonality, which is that everybody from every position is feeling the deterioration on their bodies and the difficulty of the job and the labor, and the invisibility of the labor actually continued to make the job harder. And as you get older, where do you go as an art handler? As you get older, where do you go in any of these jobs in the art world? And so really looking at not only diversifying the field or creating a more safe and internal working system for people in these jobs, it's really thinking about how do we care for each other when we're also caring for these artworks, and how do we extend the care that we want for the artworks themselves to go through all of the people in the institution.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that along that line, you know, a lot of our work is about care, right? And curators care for the objects. And we had, you know, this question of how is someone getting paid $15 an hour to care for an object that's worth millions of dollars, but if that person is injured, they're not protected at all, right? We'll leave it at that. Hi, Robert.
Hi. I'm afraid I don't have a very cool video like these guys, so I'm just going to have to talk at you and tell you what Gasworks is. So Gasworks has been around since 1994, and it is a space, a small-scale institution in Zone 2 in South London, and it was set up as the London hub of something called Triangle Network, which is an international network of small-scale also spaces in countries throughout the world. We have a lot of partners in South Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and elsewhere. And London, Gasworks in London was really envisaged as a kind of an anchor institution for the network. And originally, when it was set up, it was run by artists. So it was a building that was purchased and handed over to artists as studio space. And that really continues to be part of our DNA today. So there continues to be 8 studios that we rent out to London-based artists for a period of 5 years, which gives them time to really establish their practice and be part of a community. And also, we have an international residencies program. So we do 20 residencies a year with artists from all over the world. We have a series of recurring and ongoing residency partnerships that enable artists to spend 3 months in London. They get access to a studio space. They get their living expenses covered. They live together in a shared house. And so we often talk about the fact that as much as it's about the opportunity to spend time in London and build your network, it's also an opportunity to spend time and meet other artists from all over the world too. So there's kind of like maximization of the networking that goes on through the relationships that the artists build with one another. And it's always been really important to us that the work that we do on the residencies program is really about supporting research and development, and oftentimes it's artists' first introduction to London, so they will be able to meet people. We set up visits with local curators or curators that visit from out of town. We also, get them access to museums, and many of the institutions in London are free, which is really helpful. We take them out, we go see galleries, we go on day trips, which is cute, to other towns in the UK to see art that's happening. And so it's really a kind of immersive experience, and it really complements the studio provision that we offer, because it means that practicing artists are entering a community of practicing artists in London who have established networks and can kind of introduce them to what's going on in the city. So that feels like a really important aspect of what we do. And then alongside that, we also develop commissions with international artists. So we do 4 projects a year, and we work with them over 18 months to 2 years to develop new work. It's often their first show in London, and that really complements the activity that's going on elsewhere in the building. But fundamentally, I think, to answer your question, Barbara, about, what allyship means or what it means to be an ally, I think for us it's really about, building community and trying to think about how we can best listen to artists. And the thing that I love most about my job is that I spend time with artists from all over the world every day, from countries that I've never even been to. I learn about their work, I learn about their love life, I learn about their pets, and it's kind of everything is really part of it, and that is it's a wonderful privilege.
I think there's an element which you might not have mentioned, but that to me was always very special whenever I visited Gasworks. It is small. It retained its structure of a rather small building where everything, the kitchen is tiny, people hang out together, the studios are not so huge. So there's a sense of intimacy which comes, with being there and visiting, which I think it's also a really important element of how things are developed and done, because it doesn't have such an imposing scale which may immediately intimidate you somehow. And I was thinking that also something you were saying when we were chatting yesterday about how you started, how you wanted to create a moment of a possibility for people of coming together in the first place before doing anything else. And I was also thinking about something that Simone and Andrea were saying before, that, of course, education, it's such a huge part of what is happening, across our very different practices, that maybe that's also a category, a category of people who are practicing education in many different ways. So, maybe if you could also, return for a second on how you started and what brought you together in the first place. And, your organizations, one and the other, they're both works of artists and kind of work of arts in their own ways, because this is also how you describe your practice in some ways. So,
yeah, totally. The way we started was, I think more genuinely, once we graduated from our masters, and we realized a lot of people in our cohort didn't have jobs. So people were graduating from MFA programs that were really expensive. They were mostly working in coffee shops because they couldn't get into the art world. And we were kind of like gauging why this was happening, right? And so at the same time, we decided to do a little bit of a mixer. We just kind of put a call out there for different people who were working in the arts industry. And people drove from 2 hours away, 3 hours away in the Bay Area, and they were telling us all these stories, right? Like maybe, a woman who had been working with a team for 2 years and nobody knew her name, or someone who was trans and no one was using their proper pronouns, or someone who just was they could only paint the gallery, but they didn't get taught how to use different tools. And so we heard so many of these stories that it kind of impacted us, and we were like, okay, we need to do a little bit something around this. So we started doing some free education classes at SFAI that were free for Black and Brown, queer and trans people. And the cool thing about those classes is that the cohort that took those classes in 2018 or something like that, then they went on to have art handling jobs, and then now they're hiring managers. So they're also making sure that their teams are more diverse and that the workforce is more inclusive, which is kind of nodding to the point of that pipeline that you were talking about.
Yeah, and I think that it's been harped on a lot about having queer people and people of color in leadership positions, but it does make a huge difference. A lot of what we're talking about is about language and intention and approach, and even just like doing these projects and meeting people in all these different cities, asking them the same questions. It's amazing how much the answers resonate. And we ask very simple questions that maybe people should be asking in the workplace, like what makes a good manager or a good coworker? And if you ask your employees that and they're like, oh, it'd be great if you communicated really well or, or nicely. I think that getting that kind of feedback in real time could make a difference across the world. And especially as we kind of learned how to ask questions and continued to meet people in Mexico City and New York and LA and San Francisco, it became clear that, we all know this, I think, here, but the art world is international. And so the things that we can do or say in this context can actually also have effects on an international scale. And we affect the cities that we move into and that we build all these spaces and economies in and the people who come there. And there are people who are doing labor in the museum, and there's people who are doing labor in this fair, and all of those people are making a lot of things happen, and it's really important to value their experiences and their part and role in what we do.
Yeah, and then there's also, I think, to what Ambrose said, there's something so basic about, asking someone, like, what makes a good boss, right? And a lot of people just said, oh, someone who doesn't scream at me, someone who doesn't micromanage you, someone that trusts what you do. And I think this can be applied to all sorts of jobs, and I see people nodding. So, the simplicity of just like, how do we work with people respectfully? How do we trust that they're capable of doing things? How can we teach them something that they don't know, right? So we have basic rules like, you don't take someone's tool away as they're working because you think your way is the best way to do something, right? Or you communicate before lifting something really heavy because if you don't, you're going to hurt your back, right? So there's all of these very simple ways that can apply to so many things that we kind of like to talk about in our work.
Maybe hopping on, this idea of tools. You're also proudly wearing, so bravo, so beautiful. But yes, maybe, one possibility for thinking through forms of alliances is also, Gasworks has been taking care over the years of around 600 artists, if I get the numbers right. So what are the tools you think you're now ready to share, or which are the forms for have you put together ways of sharing good strategies that might prove helpful, and how is it possible to access them, for instance?
Yeah, I think there is an interesting parallel with what Art Handlxrs is doing in that I think one thing that we find incredibly useful is, communication and transparency in terms of people's expectations and making sure that you can match that. Because running residencies programs is great for the reasons I said before, in that you get to spend time with artists and you get to learn from them. But the kind of running joke that we also have is that running a residencies program is also like a black hole in terms of you can put as much into it as you're willing to give. And so in terms of thinking about the kind of the logistics of a team and their well-being also in terms of doing paid employment and what kind of securities they need to have to make sure that they're not literally working all the time, when in practice, pretty much with the exception of 4 weeks a year, we have 5 artists from very, very different backgrounds, very different countries in London that we're technically responsible for 24 hours a day. And sometimes that does mean that they call us drunk at 3 a.m. in the morning because they lost their keys. So, it's kind of, it's trying to work through that. Obviously, you can't necessarily mitigate that particular example, but there are many other misunderstandings that I think you can mitigate in advance through clarity of procedure. So the other thing that we also do is when we offer someone a residency, we always also send them a very clear terms of reference of what our expectations are, what our responsibilities are, so that before they accept it, they can really have a good understanding of what that entails and what their commitments are and what we kind of mutually embark on together, So I think it's this kind of stuff that is very dull, practical, invisible, that I think is really at the heart of some of the most radical aspects of the work, because it's how you kind of, through policy, somehow like change the nature of the conversation and change what's possible and change the protections that are in place for people.
I was thinking about the title of our chat, The Invisible Infrastructures of Art. And of course, I think a lot of what has been discussed, and I mean, we could discuss so much about it. It's about levels of visibility or invisibility. And why are these structures invisible ultimately? Because I think that for whoever's part of this world, the very visible, it's really part of what you do, I mean, on a daily basis in so many different ways. So I think that as much as, I mean, the past years with, I mean, all their difficulties, but also a lot of desire to affirm certain principles, made great efforts to bring forward forms of visibility. Now it's kind of in times where we're asked to reverse the entire process and very often to negate forms of visibility which have been created. And that's also possibly when to have forms of alliance can help us, because there's on one side silencing, on another side defunding, or sort of broad attacks also on what it means to, I mean, try and divide et impera, as they say, sort of divide, separate, and then control. So what do you think you've gathered through experience as a possible way of using the same tools to create maybe forms of resistance, or, I mean, ways of helping out each other to go through a moment which may be more difficult than expected, or, well, anyway, it's difficult times.
I mean, I think one of the easiest alliances that we've seen in the work that we do is that between artists and art handlers or registrars or conservators, because there are often those people holding those jobs, right? So, for instance, like I was doing an exhibition at SF MoMA as an artist, but I was working with a team of 10 art handlers who were delightful to work with, right? We were a team, we were having lunch, we were like thinking through stuff, and then the curator told me that the art handlers weren't gonna be invited to the opening of the exhibition. And that felt so outrageous to me. How can people who have worked with me for 2 weeks not being invited to this party? Because it's a donor party. So we wrote a letter with all the other artists to make sure that they were invited, and then, you know, they got invited for that one opening. Because there are moments of resistance, right, where we said as the artists, like, we're not gonna come in if these folks are not invited, because they made the work. And they also know so much about the work, they can talk to donors about it. They have great facts about that. So I can think about moments like that we've had with different artists, and then also, you know, when we started this project, people wanted us to become the diverse art handling company, and we really pushed against that. But so what we did was having this sort of like, you know, hire a prep lists where people kind of put their information, and then if people ask us if we know someone, we'll send them that list. And the beautiful thing that happened is that we had curators from the Museum of African Diaspora tell us, hey, we got all of our crew from your list. They were amazing to work with. We got people who were running the Whitney Independent program. They asked us if we knew people in New York. We sent them the list. And then actually we were in town and they invited us to come, and it was a team that was mostly trans women working. And I was, you know, this moment of really seeing how that idea materializes in a real space can be so powerful. Those solidarities that come from that.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, we're in difficult times, but every time we're in difficult times, I remember that we've always been in difficult times. And I mean, the visibility of difficulty is also its own conversation. I think that actually relates to this, like who actually sees that the time is difficult, because who's feeling the difficulty of the time. And so when we're thinking about resistance, it's about longevity. And like, you know, there's been a lot of projects that kind of crop up and want to speak to these things, and we did something that I would actually define as radical, which is like we gave ourselves the ability to do this project at a pace that makes sense to us every day. There's no specific outcome or end goal. or money or anything that we have to like run towards or stretch ourselves. So whenever we do this project, it's with our full attention and intention, and that has allowed us to do it for a long time and to continue to be in place, very steady and very still. And so when things are always moving up and down and all around, I think being able to rely on things over a long time creates that system that has roots that go so deep that no matter what happens, you cannot shake them. And I think that those are the very little things like policy, like training someone, being nice to someone one time, you know, they have very long-term effects, and they can go very far in meaning and like actually change people's entire lives. And so I think it's really important to actually also think about yourself and what you're doing and these little asks we make. Like we asked curator friends we know to be like, hey, maybe you should put the names of the art handlers on the wall. And they do. And, you know, I think the institution pushes back. And I think there's the resistance that we move forward, and then there's the resistance of being pushed back upon. And I think that when we can feel the resistance and the tension, it's actually the opportunity to continue to hold still and strong and continue pushing forward on these little policies or little things. And it's felt very good to like be able to feel grounded, knowing that something small is actually important. Because I think when things are really big, it feels overwhelming. But you know, at the end of the day, it's like my friends and the people around me are really what hold me still, and then I can hold others still, and then we can continue forward together.
I would just say, in relation to this question of visibility, I think there's something I'd like to pick up on that, you know, Ambrose was talking about, which is that, you know, it is about longevity and it's about being able to stay in the game. And I think that institutions fade in and out of visibility all of the time. And of course, this is a very visible moment, but it's also a visible moment that, in a way, you know, marks a trajectory for Gasworks of like, you know, 30 plus years of artists and staff whose like blood, sweat and tears has gone into the institution. It makes me a little bit sad to think that I can't do my job necessarily at a pace and time that suits me and feel okay about it. But I think that, you know, that speaks to like how much I and all of my colleagues and also many of the artists that we work with really put into these institutions to keep them going. It's not always easy, but obviously somehow people feel committed to the project. And I think it's important to also reflect on the fact that, you know, what Gasworks has become, you know, known for and the reputation that it's developed over the years, it didn't really embark on trying to achieve what it has achieved at the beginning. And so I think through the history of the institution, you know, it was set up as a kind of artist-run space in the mid-90s, a building handed over to a group of artists, people like Hugh Locke, Joy Gregory, Sonia Boyce, who were some of our founding artists, who took on the space because they needed space, and it was an opportunity. And obviously now, you know, many of these artists are having or have recently had major exhibitions at major institutions in the UK. But that wasn't necessarily what we started out to do. It's just part of the story and part of what happens. And likewise, so many artists that have been through Gasworks as international residents over the years, you know, they've gone on to have huge success in their career. Many of them have also given back to the institution. And one of the most wonderful things, you know, I've been director there now for just a year and a half, but I used to work there as curator for 7 years. And we celebrated our 30th anniversary last year, and we just emailed everybody to say, like, hey, come, we're having a party, you're very welcome to come. Obviously, we weren't going to pay all their flights because we can't afford to, but we invited them. And the very heartwarming responses we got from people that had done residencies in the 90s, the early 2000s, that had had studios there in the past, was really amazing and created this really warm, wonderful portrait of an institution in constant development, which has had moments where it has faded in and out of visibility. You know, in the 90s, it was really like ghettoized as a space where like artists of color would go when the art world was like preoccupied then with the YBA generation. In the early noughties, you know, it was really a space where international artists were given a platform and able to show work. And the art world in London at the time wasn't as international as it is now. And so, you know, many of the institutions that are our peer organizations in the city and indeed in the country have transformed radically to come closer in terms of the internationalization of their work to something that Gasworks has been peddling for a long time. And I don't say that to say, like, we were there first, but I think it is important to think about how these institutions shift and change and develop on the basis of the community that they construct. And they often do that by accident.
Thank you very much. I think we have, as the countdown says, about 28 seconds. So we're probably right on time. I would just love to say thank you to everybody and also invite everybody to reconsider how visible or invisible certain of our alliances are. And thank you for being here, and see you in 20 years.
Thank you so much.